Let's talk about the dehumidifier first for a second. As it turns out, I got the capacity of the bucket wrong. I got it confused with the amount of water that the machine will actually pull out of the air in a run of a day, which is 14 liters. And the bucket itself, I measured it, it's around 4 liters. So in actuality, there's a lot less water that came out of here. So where's all the water coming from? People assume that there's some source of water underneath the shop coming up through the floor slab. And I'm not going to discount that. Some moisture does come from the floor slab. I'm not at all aware of any vapor barrier underneath or moisture barrier underneath the slab. I didn't build this shop. It was here when I bought the house. And I do know, though, that it's at ground level and it's on gravel. It's not sitting on, like topsoil or anything like that. It's on a bed of gravel that's free draining, so water shouldn't be there. But of course, anything in contact with the ground is going to wake up a little bit of moisture anyway. So yes, some moisture is coming from the floor slab. Also, look around the room at all this wood that's in here. This absorbs moisture as the humidity goes up. So as the winter fades into spring and the humidity starts to climb, all of this wood that's in this room starts to absorb that moisture. And when you try to dry it out, what happens is it pulls the moisture back out of all of this wood. And it's not just the wood, it's also the drywall that's on the walls. That will absorb some moisture. Ceiling tiles up on the ceiling. Above that, there's insulation, like for more or less for sound that absorbs some moisture. Above that again, there's more drywall, which will absorb more moisture again. So everything that's in here, other than things that are made out of metal, will absorb moisture. On the topic of moisture and wood, I want to talk about plywood again. I made a video recently talking about the stability of plywood when it compares to solid wood. And that for all intents and purposes, this material, plywood, is dimensionally stable. And in that video, I got a comment from Kevin, which I later re-commented on in another video. But he said that he made a jig from a stacked up layers of plywood. As it turns out, it was particle board. He checked it again or whatever. But it varied in thickness with the humidity. And I kind of disputed that without thinking about it too much. My assumption all along was that the process of making like I said in the video that followed, the process of making the plywood would add some stability to it. The glue layers in between would limit, not ultimately, ultimately it would absorb the moisture, of course, but it would limit how quickly moisture could exit and enter the wood, because the wood, like the glue that they're using here, is waterproof, okay? And you take anything and you finish it, it slows down how quickly the moisture can penetrate it. So what you have here are these layers that are captured between layers of finish, basically. And so that would slow down the amount of expansion and contraction you would have. And you got to look at that as cyclical, because, okay, summer only lasts so long. Winter comes in and immediately it's drier. Here in my part of the world it is anyway. So during the winter, relative humidity is very low, and it draws the moisture out of wood and it shrinks. And in the summer, the relative humidity is much higher and it makes wood swell. What I'm saying with plywood is that I believe, and I still believe this, that these layers of glue between the laminations will actually slow that down to a degree. And it also depends upon how big the piece is that you're starting with and how many layers there are in there. Now, whether that's correct or not, that's really not a factor for most things that you're going to build, because the single thickness or even double thickness of nearly every, organic building material that you're going to use, like this piece of maple here is 1.5 inches thick. If I were to make something with this, I wouldn't consider this thickness as something I would have to make allowances for. It will shrink and grow with seasonal changes, but not to the point where it will make glue joints fail or cause things to crack. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to make face frames that stayed together, or even cabinet doors that are stile and rail. Like I said before, there are tolerances, there are limits, and what happens when what happens when you take a piece of wood like this and you put calipers on it? What you're gonna do is you're gonna magnify reality, because what calipers do is they show very small differences in bigger numbers. And you have a tendency to think that these bigger numbers will have a big impact. And they would if you're building something from metal, but not for wood, because you have to have some amount of tolerance built in whenever you build something from wood. Most of everything that I know, I learned as I was doing things. And that's one of the things that I never did try to do, was to stack up materials like that. Like I've seen, one that comes to mind are people build speakers with stacks of plywood or MDF that are cut out on a CNC, and it's layers stacked up. And I often said to myself, won't that expand and contract? Because I know MDF will swell and shrink with humidity changes. I know that solid wood does that, and I had a suspicion, because I've never built anything that would blindly rely on this. I knew that plywood was subject to that as well. But the problem is I never put it to the test like Kevin did. Kevin made that jig that straddles his fence, and I guess more or less immediately after the weather changed, he saw that something was going on there. It was either shrinking or it was growing, it was loosening up or getting too tight. Now I used, in the follow-up video, I used my table saw fence right here, and you can see how many layers of plywood that is, as an example. But what I didn't realize at the time was that I left more than enough space in here for the cam handle to fit. And even if the plywood did swell or shrink, it would have minimal impact on how well that worked. I've got the original cam handle here, and it is a full 2 layers of plywood, not sanded down or anything. And you can see the fit here is quite loose. And in the original build, I cut aluminum shims, 4 of them, to go in there to not only fill up that space, but also make the action smoother so it wouldn't be rubbing on the side there. Okay, and I did the same here with the new one. You can see the shims on the inside there as well. And as for why it doesn't change width with all this plywood stacked up here, you can see that the top actually bridges it across, and that is the stable part of the plywood right there. See, I'm going to try to get you in close here to look at this 3 layers of 1/2 inch plywood stacked up. Okay, now if expansion and contraction were truly significant, what would happen is that these layers in here would expand to the point where they would break that glue joint up there. But I don't know how close this camera can get in. You can see that there's no signs of that happening. So even though the plywood does expand and contract to a certain degree with seasonal moisture changes, it's not to the point where it causes damage to the project. And that's the distinction. You shouldn't get hung up on making allowances for something when the effect that it's going to have will be negligible at best. Now, the reason why I'm talking about this again is because I think it's important to clarify all this stuff so there won't be any confusion. I think that's a big problem with a lot of beginning woodworkers is that they get very confused about issues that are not really that important. Whenever I make anything from plywood, I treat the material as if it's dimensionally stable in all respects, length, width, and thickness, because typically you don't build anything that the small amount of expansion or contraction that takes place will be in any way a factor to the outcome of the project.
It's pretty confusing, right? Does it make you feel bored or stupid? Well, it's supposed to. So here's Margot Robbie in a bubble bath to explain.